Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, HIPAA, Privacy and Security. Before we begin, let's go over a few housekeeping items. If you are on the line and have not yet connected to the website, click the link in your confirmation email. Your browser may prompt you to download and run a file. When you are connected, you should see the presentation on your screen. If you have questions, you can send them via WebEx's chat function. Please take a moment and find the chat bubble icon near the bottom and center of the webinar screen. You can type and send questions throughout the presentation. We will compile them and take time at the end for answers. The webinar is being recorded and a copy will be made available to all attendees after the event. Now it's time to begin, and I will turn it over to my friend Sara Vandermolen.
Thank you, Chris. All right, everybody. I'm super excited to be talking about this today, which sounds a little bit strange because HIPAA, privacy, and security are typically known as fairly dry and boring topics. I am going to try to make it a little more interesting today, and part of that is that I want to bring it to home, so to speak. I want to make sure that this is stuff that makes sense within the type of scenarios that you guys are actively seeing and working with each day. So hopefully we can give it that kind of impact. So first up, let me give you an idea of what we're going to be doing today. First up, we're going to talk about some of the basics around HIPAA, privacy, and security. It's one of those things where a lot of us know a little bit about it, not many of us know a lot about it, and some of those details are actually fairly important. So we are going to cover some of those basics. And then we'll look at some common mistakes. It's actually a very good way to learn is to see what not to do. So we're going to get to take a look at some real scenarios that people have run afoul of that cause various HIPAA privacy and security issues, and we're going to take that as an opportunity to not be like them. Then once we've got an idea of how some of these mistakes play out in real life, we'll talk about prevention and mitigation. So we're going to talk about how to prevent breaches and then what to do if one happens to keep it from being as bad as it could be. And then lastly, we'll talk about compliance, and specifically we're going to talk about tips for causing behavior changes with your staff. There's a lot of times that we say it's important to do this thing, but then actually creating the behavior changes so that that thing is done, that's a whole nother story. So that's where I'm going to bring in some adult learning principles and some of the information about how people learn. That's where that's going to come in. Now, I should mention that I am not a lawyer, so as I go through all of these, this is based off of research and off of various subject matter experts. None of this should be construed as legal advice. So first up, let's talk about those basics. Now, when we talk HIPAA, privacy, and security, the first thing I want to do is I want to bring it back to the people, because that's really what this is about. It's about people who have health information that may be very sensitive to them. It may be something that causes them grief. It may be something that they're scared to have anybody else know about, and it's in our trust. So when we're talking HIPAA, privacy, and security, we need to remember that we want to ensure that our people that have entrusted this information to us have privacy. They should be anonymous as far as the outside world is concerned. Now, because not everybody plays by the rules, we also have to be proactive and have some security. The security is going to be the steps that we take to ensure that private information stays private, even if there are people out there who think that it should be otherwise and may want to use the information for their own gain. So let's move into some acronyms. Because this is healthcare, we have to have acronyms. So the first one is PHI, and hopefully this is something that you guys have all heard of. But PHI stands for Protected Health Information. Protected health information is going to include things like name and date of birth. Social security number is a big one. Address can be one. All of these different things that could lead to identifying a patient should be considered PHI. Now, one of the nuances around PHI is that sometimes it's not a single piece of information, but a combination of pieces. So if you have a very large population and a generic diagnosis like a cough or perhaps bronchitis, the diagnosis in that case on its own is not going to be really PHI, it's not going to lead you to the identity of a person. Even if you add, say, an age to that. In a large population with a common diagnosis, it's still not enough specificity to really get anywhere with it. But what if you were to change the scenario and now you're in a very small town and you have an area where everybody knows everybody and there's only one person within the age that we have that has that particular diagnosis? Especially as we get to more unusual diagnoses, congenital defects, cancers, things that are a little bit less common, and especially as the population size gets smaller, you have a higher and higher chance that someone would be able to use that information to identify the patient. Now, the way I think about it, because I need to have a scenario or an example in my brain for these kinds of things, is I think about reporters who are stalking celebrities. You know, they're trying to get the next scoop for their paper, and some of them are very inventive, and they can put together the puzzle pieces to figure out what a celebrity's been doing. So imagine that your patients are celebrities, and somebody is out there trying to figure out what kind of medical care they are receiving. If they could put together the puzzle pieces out of the information available and come to that person's identity, then we have a PHI problem. If the only information available is not specific enough to lead them to that identity, even if they are very inventive reporters there, then we're probably okay on the PHI. The next one down, most people, when I do this live, we've only had a couple people who knew this one right off the bat. This one, CE, is covered entity, and this refers specifically to a HIPAA covered entity. So these are going to be entities that are bound by HIPAA, and that's going to include payers, it's going to include clearinghouses, and providers who send any kind of electronic standardized transaction. Now, covered entities, being HIPAA covered entities, are liable for maintaining HIPAA levels of privacy and security. The next one down, up until more recently at least in the game, was not bound to do that. The BA stands for business associate, and this is someone who contracts with the covered entity to provide some kind of service that requires them to come in contact with PHI. So if you have a doctor's office and they do dictation, and then they send those recordings off to a third party that they've contracted with, a medical transcriptionist, to get those notes transcribed, that transcriptionist would be an example of a business associate. Now, it is actually possible to have a business associate of a business associate. If for some reason that medical transcriptionist contracted with another third party to do something for their business that also involved that third party having access to PHI as part of their duties, well, now you've got an inception level of business associates all tracking back to that covered entity. Now, these are some concepts that we're going to be using throughout, so keep this in mind. PHI, CE for covered entity, and BA for business associate. That is going to continue to be important as we move on. Now, this one hopefully everybody has heard of, HIPAA, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. It really sort of set the stage for some baseline expectations around privacy and security. Now, there are three very well-known areas or permitted uses for PHI in which you don't have to get special consent from the patient before sharing. These are known as treatment, payment, and operations, collectively known as TPO. So if in the course of your duties to treat the patient, you need to send PHI to another party, for example, to consult with another doctor, to do a referral, to send out a prescription, these are all part of treating the patient. That is a permitted use under HIPAA. So you'd be okay with that. Next up is payment. We definitely need to submit PHI to insurance companies in order to get reimbursed. So payment is also a covered permitted use under HIPAA. Then we have operations. So this, for example, it might be a supervisor who needs to monitor calls to ensure call quality. You might need to do some sort of quality review. There might be audits. The sorts of things that make sure that the operation can continue to treat patients, they fall under this last use case and would also be a permitted use. Now, there's kind of a lesser known cousin to these that is also worth mentioning, which is called imminent threat. So imminent threat says that if you have the opportunity to prevent or mitigate the impact of an imminent threat to a person or to the public, then if this is your professional medical judgment, then you actually have a permitted use to share that PHI, even without consent. Now, a couple notes about this. It should be an imminent threat, so not something that's going to happen a month from now, something that's going to happen or could happen so quickly that you need to act right away. It also needs to be a real threat. This can't be something that it's just, oh, I think maybe this will happen. No, it has to be credible. It has to be something that you are pretty sure is going to happen. For example, if you have a behavior therapist, they have a credible belief that someone is going to be hurting someone else. They've made a threat against someone else, and it seems credible they will actually go and take action. That would be a case where they could share the identity of that patient, PHI, with, for example, law enforcement. It could be if you know somebody who has an extremely contagious disease like measles, something like that, and you need to do something to prevent them from being in the public sphere, or if they're already in the public sphere, you need to contact someone and have them quarantined. That could also fall under imminent threat. Now, from the HHS.gov website, there was a statement that said that OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, would not second-guess a health professional's good faith belief that a patient poses a serious and imminent threat to the health or safety of the patient or others, and that the situation requires the disclosure of patient information to prevent or lessen the threat. So basically, you're not required to do this. This is a permitted use, not an obligation. But if you were to do it, you don't have to sit by and watch something terrible happen because you thought you couldn't share that PHI. Now, if you do an imminent threat disclosure, please make sure to document everything. I'll talk more about this a little bit later in the webinar, but there is a place to note down any of these disclosures that happened to make sure that everything is all covered and buttoned up. Okay, so we've got HIPAA and we've got these permitted uses. I've already mentioned them briefly, but there is an entity that is responsible for ensuring that HIPAA and these permitted uses are all dealt with appropriately. And that is OCR, which is part of HHS. OCR is the Office of Civil Rights, and HHS is Health and Human Services. So these are the guys who will go out and do HIPAA compliance audits, among other things. So if anyone has ever experienced one of these are extremely tough. UHIN had to go through one a number of years ago, and it was the toughest audit that we had ever had to go through, I think probably since as well. They usually have findings when they do audits. So if you ever get audited, make sure you have all of your I's dotted and your T's crossed and all of your paperwork ready to go. Now, OCR and HIPAA, and this was one big happy family for a little while, but after HIPAA was implemented, the coming years was showing the industry that there were still some gaps. There were some ways in which PHI was still not being protected appropriately, and they needed to do something about it. So a number of years later, in 2009 and 2013 respectively, they added HITECH and Omnibus. And these new pieces of legislation introduced a couple of additional changes. First of all, they actually encompassed business associates, or BAs, in the requirements for privacy and security. Because before, BAs were kind of left completely out, which doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Because we've got protected health information, it's sensitive, those identities are important and need to stay anonymous, and just because it goes to a BA, suddenly they're not required to do anything to protect that? No. So this was a very good thing that they closed that gap. Now BAs are equally liable, and they have to treat that PHI with the appropriate level of privacy and security. It also tied BAs to their CEs, their covered entities that contracted with them. So if there's a breach on a BA's part, then the CE could also be liable. And that may seem unfair at first, but when you think about it, what it does is it encourages CEs, covered entities, to be very careful about whom they are contracting with. They need to make sure that their BAs are trustworthy, that they have good privacy and security practices, that they have good policies and procedures in place, and that they're going to take all of the necessary care to ensure that that PHI remains safe. Another thing they did is they increased the fines that are possible for some kind of violation. Now, the fines were mostly increased because the initial levels of fines were not high enough to get the attention of some of the offenders. They had some cases where people were doing unsafe practices, and when they were caught, well, you know, the fine wasn't really big enough to matter, so they just kind of laughed it off. So they gave the fines a little more teeth, and in the hopes that people would take it very seriously. So another thing they did is they decreased the leniency available when a violation was found. It used to be that the parties investigating could waive the fines, mostly up to their discretion, but what they really wanted to do was say certain types of violations are bad enough that there should be no waiving of fines in those cases, and so they took those options away. Okay, so we've got OCR, we've got HIPAA, we've got high-tech, we've got all of these legislations that are saying here's what you need to do to ensure that this stuff remains private and secure. So what happens when you do need to release some information, or what happens if some information comes out? Let's talk about how that happens. First of all, disclosure. This term has a very specific meaning. So release, transfer, provision of, access to, or divulging in any other manner information outside the entity. That's boring. Let's look at it like this. So we've got an organization, we have information that is held by that organization, and the information is somehow sent out of the organization. That is the basis of disclosure. Now that's not in and of itself a bad thing, not necessarily. What we want to avoid is improper disclosure. So this is the disclosure of confidential and privileged records or documents to someone who's not authorized. So you start with something that should remain confidential, and then for some reason it goes somewhere that is not authorized to handle it. Now you may be wondering, is improper disclosure the same thing as a breach? Well, yes and no. So here's the definition of a breach. We've got acquisition, access, use, or disclosure of PHI in a manner not permitted, which compromises the security or privacy of the PHI. Now let's break that down a bit. Now we've got a couple different ways in which the breach can happen. So we've got acquisition, access, use, and look at that, disclosure. So disclosure is a way that a breach can happen, but it is not the only way. Disclosure is just one of those many options that all fall under the larger umbrella of a breach. Okay, so now we've got this bit about that says in a manner not permitted. Well, we talked about TPO and imminent threat disclosures. Those are permitted uses. So if it's not one of those, then we're probably in breach territory. And then this last part, which compromises the security or privacy of the PHI. And that brings me to a very important concept, which is your PHI secured? Because I'll tell you, unsecured PHI is what happens when it's not rendered unusable, unreadable, or indecipherable to unauthorized persons, to people who shouldn't have access to it. That would be in the clear. So if you have PHI that is unsecured, and it is acquired, accessed, used, or disclosed, and it's not under TPO or imminent threat, then that PHI has been compromised. The security and privacy of it has been compromised. Now, what if you had secure PHI? This would primarily be encrypted PHI. And if you guys are not familiar with encryption, definitely talk to your IT people or do some web research. There are a lot of companies that do it nowadays, and it makes sure that your data, as long as nobody else has the key, which is usually a password, then anyone who shouldn't be having access to it can't read it even if they get their hands on it. So in that case, the PHI is rendered unusable, unreadable, or indecipherable. So if it is outside of the building, if it's outside the organization in a manner not permitted, well, has the security and privacy of that PHI really been compromised? Well, if it's encrypted, well, no, it hasn't. So encryption is one of those things that if you take one thing away from this webinar, I want it to be that encryption is massively important to ensuring that your organization does not have breaches. Now, I've mentioned this thing in a manner not permitted, and I keep going back to TPO and imminent threat. There are actually a couple of other, they're not quite permitted uses, but they are considered exclusions, and there's 3 of them. I want to go through them real fast to give you an idea of what they consider officially to be excluded from a breach. So these things are not breaches. The first one is unintentional acquisition. So as an example, let's say that we've got a doctor who picks up the chart for the wrong patient, not someone they treat at all, it's for a different doctor in the same building. This would not be a breach if the doctor is operating under the authority of a CE, covered entity, or BA. So in our example, our doctor works at that particular facility, that part we're okay. If the mistake was made in good faith, so they didn't intentionally go and pick up the wrong record, it was just an accident. In this case, we'd still be okay. If the acquisition was within scope, now it is within scope for doctors to look at charts. That is completely part of their normal duties. If it was a janitor who picked up the chart, well, then we might have more of an issue because that is not typically within the scope of a janitor's duties. And then if there is no further harm. And so if the doctor had picked up the chart and goes, oh, hey, I didn't know that Jerry came here. You know, when did he pick up an STD? You know, like that's the sort of thing that would be constituted as further harm. There was no need to shout the information across the room where maybe other people could hear. No, instead, our doctor looked at the chart, realized it was the wrong one, and quietly put it away. So that would, in this case, fall under the unintentional acquisition exclusion. Now you'll notice this is a very narrowly defined exclusion, and you'll find that with the other 2 I'm going to show you that is the case. There's not a lot of wiggle room in here, and that is intentional. The next one is inadvertent disclosure. So let's say that you're sending a record to someone named Susan in your office, and you need them to take a look at this PHI. But instead of sending it to Susan, you actually sent it to a different Susan. It's the wrong Susan. So this would be an exclusion and not a breach if it meets the following criteria. Both the person sending and the person receiving have to be authorized to view PHI. So our wrong Susan over here must be someone who is authorized and regularly reviews PHI. If both the sender and the receiver work for the same organization. So this other Susan can't just be you know, in another organization. They have to be in, like, say, another department of the same organization. And if there was no further harm. So if the wrong Susan contacted you and said, you know what, I got this email, I don't think it's for me, so I have permanently deleted my copy of the PHI. Well, if you meet all that criteria, then you're probably in this exclusion. Now, if the other person did not tell you that they've deleted their PHI, maybe they sent it somewhere else and they shared it or they showed it to someone else, suddenly you start having this further harm thing come in and you're no longer in the exclusion. The third and last one is unable to retain information. So as an example, let's say that an insurance company sends a paper explanation of benefits chock full of PHI to the wrong address. This would not be a breach if the mistake was made in good faith and if they had a good faith belief that the information would not be retained. So for example, let's say that our EOB that went to the wrong place, it came back as returned to sender and it had not been opened. That would fall under this exclusion. Or perhaps you have a pharmacist who gives the wrong bag to a patient but discovers it right away and calls them back before they've gone more than about 10 steps. Unless that patient opened up the bag in those 10 steps and memorized all the PHI inside, you probably have a good faith belief that they did not retain any PHI included in that wrong pharmacy bag. So again, these exclusions are very, very narrowly defined. And again, that is intentional. So we're down to these 3 exclusions, the permitted uses, and if it's not one of those, it's probably a breach. So if you have acquisition, access, use, or disclosure, and it's not one of those things, it is presumed to be a breach unless you can demonstrate a low probability that that PHI has been compromised. So innocent till proven guilty is not the case here. So let's say that you're in this situation and you need to show that there is a low probability the PHI has been compromised. You've got 4 potential legs to stand on. The first is the nature and extent of the PHI. So if the type of the PHI that got out or the amount of the PHI that got out, maybe it's small enough or limited enough that you can make the argument it was not a breach. The unauthorized person receiving PHI. Let's say that it is a known entity who may not be in the same organization, so they don't fall under that exclusion, but you know who they are, and they tell you that they've deleted the PHI. They're fairly low risk. Now, you could try and make that argument it was not a breach based on that. Whether the PHI was actually acquired or viewed. So if it was something that's accessed remotely, can you prove that they never actually viewed it before you deleted it or got it back? Maybe it was PHI that was left behind in a room, but maybe someone went back and got it before anybody got in there and found it. So those are the types of situations where you might be able to show that the PHI was not actually taken by anybody, or that if it was, that it wasn't viewed. And then last, we've got the extent to which the risk to PHI has been mitigated. Big one on this is going to be that encryption again. So if your data is encrypted, as long as they didn't get the key, that data is useless to them even if they got it. So that's going to be a big, big one. Again, encryption, encryption, encryption. I'll just keep repeating that throughout the whole rest of the webinar. Now let's say that the worst happens. There's a breach. What happens next? Penalties, yay. So there are two different entities that will typically assign penalties for HIPAA privacy and security breaches. The first is HHS, Health and Human Services, and the other is the State Attorney Generals. Most people listening to this webinar will probably not be in the type of situation where their breaches will be multi-state. But if you are, or if you know anyone who is, maybe give them a heads up that the State Attorney Generals, plural, can come and ask for a fine or give you a penalty if their particular state was affected. So if you have multi-state breaches, you could have multiple state attorney generals coming with a penalty. Those penalties can be up to $25,000 per violation category per calendar year. Now, there are a couple of other things that will cause someone to take a financial hit after a breach that are not precisely categorized as penalties, but because they do have an impact, I wanted to mention them. First up, we've got free credit monitoring. If anyone has gotten one of those letters from maybe one of those big credit card breaches, it says, you have been given a year of free credit monitoring, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, unless you've got some sort of HIPAA privacy and security insurance policy, you're probably paying for that out of pocket if you have a breach. So make sure to keep that in mind. It's not just the penalties that come from the government or from the oversight agencies. There are also other financial implications. And then there's something that HHS has a website, and one of the pages on the website will publicly list all of the breaches that have affected over 500 individuals. So you'll see the name of the company, you'll see the cause of the breach, and you'll see the number of people affected by it. This is unofficially known in the industry as the wall of shame. So if you were to have a breach that affected over 500 people, you may appear on that wall of shame. And while I'm not saying that a lot of people routinely go there to double check their partners before they sign contracts and things, it's not completely out of the question, and it is a bit of a hit to the reputation. So just maybe keep that in mind. This is not something that will stay private. If you have a big breach, it's going public. Now, I haven't yet talked about the exact penalties that HHS assigns, so let's cover that. There are civil penalties, so money, 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 and there are 4 different violation categories. The first one is did not know. So you didn't know about the violation that caused the breach, or you didn't know about the violation that was found during an audit. And even if you had known and taken reasonable care, or even if you'd taken a reasonable amount of care to abide by HIPAA, maybe you still wouldn't have prevented this violation. That's the smallest category, and it starts at $100 per up to $50,000 per violation, with a cap of $1.5 million per year. So that's the best. If you're going to have a penalty, that's the best one, because then they start getting harder. The next one down is reasonable cause, which means you didn't know about the violation, but maybe you should have. You had reasonable cause to be aware that there was a violation happening, But even if you'd taken a reasonable amount of care to abide by HIPAA, maybe you still couldn't have prevented it. So that's the reasonable cause violation category. Starts at $1,000, goes up to $50,000, just like the other. Now, in both of those cases, there is still some option for the auditor or whoever's assigning the penalty to waive the fine and make it a warning. That is still something that's possible at these two levels. At the next two levels up, however, that is no longer an option. So the fines for the next two levels are mandatory. So the next one is willful neglect, which is corrected. So somebody knew that there was a violation, but nothing was done about it. And then maybe at some point later, it was then corrected. So this is a $10,000 minimum penalty per violation, again up to $50,000. And then willful neglect not corrected. Ooh, that's the worst one. So somebody knew there was a problem and then nobody did anything about it, period. That one is a straight up $50,000 per violation. Now, just in case you were wondering, there are criminal penalties as well. So, and because you can't exactly put the idea of an organization in jail, you would have to jail individuals. This is applied to individuals. So, the first category there is reasonable cause or no knowledge of the violation. So this is still kind of the first two categories on the previous slide combined. This one, the penalty is up to 1 year in jail. If you obtain PHI under false pretenses, you're looking at up to 5 years. And if you obtain PHI for personal gain or with malicious intent, that is up to 10 years. So if you ever hear those stories about a jealous ex who tries to call in and find out if the ex-person's new partner has some, maybe if they're pregnant or if they have some kind of illness and, those kinds of things, we're looking at those last two violation categories. It's a big deal. Now, if you were to total it all up, and thankfully someone already did this work for me, they looked at a 15-month period and they found that $402 is the average cost per compromised record. And that was between 2015 and 2016, so it might have increased a little bit since then, but this was the most recent stat I could find. So $402 is per record. So think about how many records you hold at your place of business. And if you were to have a breach involving all of those records, multiply that by 402, and you have a basic idea of how much you might expect to be paying in penalties. So now let's talk about some real scenarios where people actually had breaches. This is all from those public websites like the Wall of Shame. It is public information. So this is a good example of what not to do. We're going to start with Memorial Healthcare System. They actually had two different violations. There was impermissible access of PHI by employees, and then there was impermissible disclosure of PHI to affiliated physicians' offices. So the impermissible access is an employee was accessing PHI that they really had no business getting into. One of the more common ones that seems to happen, they're not even intending anything bad, but maybe they look up the record of a family member. Just because they have the access doesn't mean that it's okay for them to be going in and looking at records for just anyone. They still have to be covered under treatment, payment, operations, or imminent threat. Next, the impermissible disclosure of PHI. We're talking about maybe someone sent the information to an affiliated physician office who also did not fit under TPO, imminent threat, or even one of the exclusions. So think again, we're going back to that celebrity example that we talked about earlier. So if you have a celebrity, and you start sharing information on them and it's not covered under one of those things, this is the kind of violation category we might expect to see. This particular violation affected over 115,000 people, and they ended up paying $5.5 million in penalties. The next one is Metro Community Provider Network, who had a lack of security management processes to safeguard ePHI. So they didn't have a process for their staff to follow that would ensure that ePHI was kept safe. If you don't have a process, you can't realistically expect the employees to continually take the right actions to make sure it's safe. So the processes are important. This violation affected 3,200 people, and they were assigned a $400,000 penalty. Now, if I were to put up those reasons again, so we've got the impermissible access, impermissible disclosure, lack of security management processes, If we had to summarize a category of preparations or precautions that everyone could take to try and ensure that they do not fall into this bucket and they do not have this kind of violation, I would sum it up as policies, procedures, and training. Have policies to ensure that it's clear what the expectations are from your organization regarding safeguarding PHI. Have a procedure so people know how to implement the policy. And then have training to ensure that any other kinks are worked out, that everyone has the correct access, and everyone knows exactly what steps to take to follow the procedure correctly. As another example, we have a life insurance company that had a theft of an unencrypted USB storage device. So one of those little thumb drives, it was unencrypted, it had PHI, and it got stolen. So this is, remember that unsecured PHI bubble from a couple slides ago? This is where that really comes in handy, because when that PHI got stolen, because it was unencrypted, immediately we can assume that the privacy and security of that PHI was compromised. This particular breach involved 2,209 people, and they ended up paying $2.2 million. Then we have CardioNet, who had the theft of an unencrypted laptop. So again, it was unsecured PHI. Theirs was just shy of 1,400 people, and they paid $2.5 million. So if I were to put these reasons back up here and we were to try and come up with a common thread, some type of preparation or precaution, I would put that into the category of physical security and encryption. So if you have mobile devices or any kind of place that's got PHI, make sure there's physical security to ensure that it's either not leaving the building, that the building itself is locked down, that the information is always locked up. If it has to go in transport, maybe it's in the trunk of a car that's locked, those types of things. And then, of course, encryption. So even if the information gets into the wrong hands, as long as the information is encrypted and they didn't get the key, the privacy and security is still maintained on that PHI. Last set of examples. We've got University of Massachusetts Amherst, who had a malware infection. That's always nasty. But theirs involved 1,600, 1,700 people, and they paid $650,000. Oh, and for those of you who aren't aware, malware infections, if you think about those viruses that you might pick up on the internet where, lights start flashing and, if people start spamming your contacts and making it look like it's you, that sort of thing could be a malware infection. We also have Arkansas Oral Facial Surgery Center. They were the targets of a ransomware attack. And if you're not familiar with what that is, I'll be going over it a little bit later, but the word ransom in there gives a pretty good idea. So this ransomware attack involved 128,000 people. It's not public knowledge how much ended up being paid out on that, but I can assume that with a number like 128,000, it was not cheap. And then we have the University of Mississippi Medical Center, who had an unprotected network drive. So it wasn't just breached, but it was actually unprotected. Not a good thing. It affected 10,000 people, and the fine was $2.75 million. So again, if we were to look once more at the reasons for these particular violations and think about what we could do to prevent that, the big thing here is going to be technical security. So this is your IT. This is having good virus protection. This is having, encryption. This is servers and all of those different things. Technical security is super important. So now that I've thoroughly probably alarmed everybody, let's talk about how you can actually prevent this from happening to you. And then if it does happen, what to do about it to make the impact as low as possible. First of all, just in case anyone was wondering, ignorance of HIPAA is actually not considered a defense. So saying I didn't know is not good enough. Your better bet is to have good policies and procedures in place, including a compliance plan. This compliance plan is going to tell your organization what the expectations are and how you're going to follow them regarding the safety and security of PHI. Now, this compliance plan needs to be updated regularly and shared around internally, because your compliance plan does zero amount of good, either practically or in an audit, if it's 10 years old and nobody knows about it. So it's got to be a living document, probably something that should be updated annually. Now, inside your compliance plan, you should have a risk assessment. This is another big one. Is another one of those, if you're only going to take one or two things out of this webinar, it's going to be this. I'm going to make it the risk assessment. So the risk assessment is all pre-breach stuff, figuring out where are your weaknesses. So, and not just so that you can notify them and then never work on them, by the way. You need to figure out your weaknesses and then actually work on them. And then identify the different policies and procedures that are going to get you to a better privacy and security standpoint. Now, one thing that you should also consider is your business associate contracts, because what we've got going there is remember, your CEs are liable if a BA breaches. So you've got a potential weak point there if you're not being very careful about your BAs. So first of all, vet your BAs before you contract with them. But then in your contracts, make sure that you're including some stipulations, like perhaps maybe you reserve the right to audit them every so often, or maybe they need to go through some kind of assessment and give you the results of it on a regular basis. Maybe there's some kind of attestation, or you need to be able to see their policies and procedures regarding privacy and PHI. Give yourself some ability to have a window into their privacy and security practices so that you know that you're putting everything in the right bucket, because you're putting some trust in with them. Another thing to think about is timelines, because if there is a breach in certain circumstances, mostly when the BA is considered an agent for the CE, if the BA discovers the breach, that is the moment when both the BA and the CE start being liable for the timeline. There's a limited amount of time to get certain required things done. And if the BA doesn't tell you about that breach until you're 3/4 of the way through that timeline, that puts you in a really hard place. So maybe have some kind of stipulation in there that your BAs must notify you of any breaches or suspected breaches within a couple of days. Maybe it's a week, maybe it's an hour, whatever you decide is reasonable. And then have some training requirements in there. And so this is just going to be things like maybe all staff need to get privacy and security training once a year, or maybe it's once a quarter, or maybe they do a formal training once a year and they also have to complete some sort of quiz or self-assessment, or there's some other type of activity at another point in the year. Whatever you consider reasonable for your organization, I would suggest minimum of a training once per year. Make sure to put that in your risk assessment. The risk assessment, I've said, is possibly the most important part of your compliance plan. It is also one of the main things that they will look for during a HIPAA privacy and security audit. It is also one of the things that will cause most people to fail because they do not have it, or because they maybe did it once and never looked at it again. So having a living document as your risk assessment that is updated perhaps annually, that is continually checked to ensure that it's covering all of your bases, that is going to be one of your best tools to actually keep everything private and secure. Now, there's also something called a risk analysis, which is typically something that happens after a breach, but it's good to set the stage. Do your groundwork ahead of time so that if a breach were to happen, you can respond in the best possible way. So a risk analysis should identify threats. So if you do have a breach, you need to figure out pretty quickly who got in and how did they get in. And you need to make sure that was it only one threat that got in, and are there others that you need to be aware of? So maybe lay the groundwork so that that's one of the first things you can do. Identify the cause. So was it a password that didn't get changed? Was was some kind of update to the system not done in a timely manner? Whatever the cause is, make sure that you're identifying that pretty darn quickly. And don't forget to check for other vulnerabilities as well, because if they get in through one system, they might be able to get into additional systems from that one system they got into. So double check and see if there are other threads that you need to go through and make sure are okay. So coming back to that risk assessment tool, because yet again, if you're going to get one or two things out of it, this should be it. If you don't have a risk assessment, or if yours is not updated and you need to reformat it or something, check this out. Excuse me. HHS has a free risk assessment tool. It is just out on the web. I will make sure that you guys get a copy, an electronic copy of a handout that has this link. And then this webinar is also being recorded, so you'll be able to see it in the recording. But go out, check out this link, go through their risk assessment tool. Again, this is one of your biggest preparations that you can do to ensure you stay secure. Now, besides policies and procedures, it's also good to have a good technology infrastructure to prevent breaches. This should include firewall and virus detection. I know it can sometimes be really annoying when it's constantly popping up with, the programs they've blocked that you actually wanted, but don't turn it off and don't ignore it, please. These things are actually very important. Also, encrypt, encrypt, encrypt. I said I would keep coming back to it, and gosh darn, I sure will. So encryption should be on any device that holds PHI, and it should be for PHI that is both in motion and at rest. What that means is if it's in motion, it is going from point A to point B. It's being copied to another server. It's being backed up somewhere. It's being sent through an email server. It's being sent through a fax server. Wherever it's going, it should be encrypted. And then at rest, it's just wherever it's saved, it's just sitting there, nobody's interacting with it, it should still be encrypted there. It's also a good idea to have an off-site offline backup. So what this means is that the backup is not on the physical premises with the rest of your technology or with your business. So if something were to happen at that physical site, your off-site backup is still okay. And offline means that it's not connected until you need it. So if someone were to hack into your regular systems, because that backup is offline, there's no connection for them to get into your backup, so your backup will remain clean. That's especially important if you are ever the target of a ransomware attack. I did mention I would come back to this one. So ransomware is where someone will hack into a computer system, they will gain control of it, they'll lock out the original owners, and then they'll say, pay up a certain amount of money. Usually it's tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they'll say, if you don't do that, we will either delete your data or we'll publish it to the open web. And when you're dealing with PHI, that is, of course, a very big deal. PHI and health records are very, very valuable on the black market. Your best case scenario in a ransomware attack is to completely burn down the server that's been infected, or somehow shut it down, delete it yourself, wipe it if you have to, and then make sure that the attackers are locked out and then restore from your backup. That is going to be your best case scenario. However, that is still not going to get you entirely away from reporting this as a breach, because actually if we look at this, OCR has said in many instances, the attacker is going to retain the data. So if they had access to it at any point, even if you wipe the server later, they could have made a copy of it. And then even if you pay the ransom, a lot of times they're going to sell it on that black market. And that's why OCR guidance is that any ransomware attack is presumed to be a reportable breach. So prevention is probably the main thing to do for ransomware. If you get into it, there's no really good answer. But if you do, your best case scenario is, again, have a clean backup you can restore from. And then that way you can not have to give in to those demands. Now, once you have your technology infrastructure, you also have to keep it current, because electronics move awfully fast these days. You guys might have noticed that. So when you have technology, make sure it's a priority to patch vulnerabilities quickly. When there are viruses that go out, they can spread incredibly quickly, just like a human virus. So make sure that your IT people have the connections they need to hear about the viruses, and that they have the workflows and the priorities set so that if a vulnerability comes up, they can drop everything and patch it right away. Also, make sure to keep things clean. If you have PHI that's not being used, dispose of it, but of course do it properly. If you've caught a paper PHI, don't just toss it in the dumpster, shred it. If you have electronic PHI, make sure it is permanently deleted off of hard drives before that hard drive goes anywhere else. Make sure to close any unused ports and disable unused accesses. So especially when there's turnover in a company, make sure that you're closing off the people who have moved on from being able to access any of their old usernames and passwords, especially if they had access to PHI. And then if you've got mobile devices, any of them that have PHI should be secured as well. And this is becoming more and more common. Healthcare is kind of on the move. So think about doing things like encrypting your mobile devices. It's possible. There are programs out there that will do it. Enforcing screen lock so that there's no way to just swipe and open up a device that has PHI. There has to be a password of some kind. Make sure that firewalls are updated. Make sure that you have the opportunity to remotely lock a device or maybe even remotely wipe it. So if it does get lost or stolen, it'll just become a very expensive brick in someone's hands and they can't get into that PHI. And maybe prevent them from accessing public Wi-Fi because that does carry a higher security risk than a secured Wi-Fi. Now, phishing is the human element because we've been talking about the technology element, but as something our security officer keeps saying is humans are actually the biggest liability to privacy and security in any organization. And one of the biggest reasons for that is something called phishing. So phishing is the attempt to get some kind of concession out of somebody, some kind of information, usually password information, from someone who shouldn't be giving it out. And it's trying to trick them into it, like the type of phishing that we see here with the image with bait. So watch out for phishing attempts. They're going to try and be sneaky. Some of them are sneakier than others. I'm sure you guys have all seen some of those really, really bad spam emails, and it's like, oh, no one would ever click on that. But that's the low end of the spectrum. Some of them do get pretty clever. You might see sometimes that they're going to phish by spamming a domain. So they're just going to send a ton of emails in the hopes that somebody will click on something. And then if they click on something, then maybe it'll either lead them to a website where they are tricked into entering in their credentials to something, and then they capture those credentials. Or maybe when they click on something, it installs a keystroke logger on their computer. So what they do from then on their keyboard is recorded and sent to the hackers, and then they are able to recreate passwords and such. So that's one way that could happen. If they're not spamming, though, you may find that they are doing targeted emails. Now, the bigger targets are going to be the people with more access or more authority. So IT people, managers, heads of companies, if any of you guys are listening, you're bigger targets because you have the opportunity to get a hacker into more systems. So if someone gets an email from their boss, or at least it looks like it's from their boss, and it says, hey, can you reset my password? And let's say that this boss doesn't usually access this system, or maybe they don't usually ask this particular employee to reset passwords, or maybe that's not the company procedure for resetting passwords. Those are all reasons why someone might want to be suspicious and think, I wonder if this was a phishing attempt. Now, with one or both of those, we may also find some level of impersonation. So this would be the same thing as someone impersonating a boss in the company. If anyone has gotten one of those emails that went around, I think it was about a year ago, where it was, hi, help, I'm a loved one and I'm in a foreign country and they took my passport and I'm stuck here and I need you to wire money so I can get home. That is a classic impersonation scheme. So when you're in healthcare, you're going to need to expect some level of that. They're not always going to be as blatant as the ones where someone is stuck in a foreign country. So just kind of keep an eye out. Is someone asking for something that is unusual? Is it something that should be going through a different process and they're asking you to shortcut it? Those are all reasons to be suspicious. Now, it's also good to have some level of filtering on your emails. This person who is a VP of Crisis and Risk Management says there's no amount of technology that can account for human error or deceptions when it comes to suspicious emails. Don't wait for a breach to occur. Be proactive. So, train your humans, but also have some technological backup to help keep the suspicious emails from even getting to them. Now, if the worst happens and you do have to report a breach, what you need to do is going to depend heavily on how many people are affected. So that's actually going to be one of your first things to do after you're identifying the threat and cutting them out of the system. If you have more than 500 people affected by a breach, then you have 60 days to notify both the patients and Health and Human Services, and the clock begins with first knowledge. So if your frontline employee is the one who notices it, then regardless of when they report it to the VP or the IT person, and regardless of when that person responds to it, when that first employee knew is when your 60 days starts. Now, what if you have less than 500 people affected? Well, in that case, you still have 60 days to notify patients, but you no longer have to notify HHS in that same time frame. Instead, what you do is you put that breach on a list of breaches and disclosures. And by the way, this disclosure area is also where you'll put any imminent threat disclosures. And then at the end of the year, you're supposed to be uploading this list of breaches and disclosures to HHS. This is an expected part of being a covered entity, by the way. So everybody should be maintaining one of these lists and uploading it. And the link to upload is also something I will be sending out to anyone who registered. And for anyone who watches the video later, we'll make sure to post that under the video. Now, we need to create some behavior changes in order to make sure that we don't have to deal with all that notification, right? So the way to do this is to hit a couple of things that will help humans recognize what they need to do and why they need to do it. So first of all, you need to make sure that you've got executive buy-in, because if any of you have tried to do some kind of an initiative that the executives did not buy into, I would bet dollars to donuts that that initiative did not go very far. People do take their instruction from the top, and if they see the executives are not really invested in privacy and security, if they're rolling their eyes and going, oh yeah, well, I guess we have to do this, but you know, it doesn't really matter, people are going to take that in and they are going to say, oh, well, if the executive thinks that, well, then maybe it's not really that important, or maybe this is really a ridiculous policy and it's, you know, okay if it slips once in a while. So executive buy-in is critical. Next, make sure that you're rewarding proper behavior. This does a couple things. One, it gives people a positive reason to strive for the proper behavior, but it also helps reinforce what the proper behavior is. Sometimes it just really helps to have a policy or procedure in context. So, and this doesn't have to be a big or expensive thing. It can be a public shout out at a staff meeting that says, hey, Cindy did a really good job of dealing with this potential security incident. This is what happened and this is what she did, and that was just really well done. You know, just some sort of public kudos will accomplish both aims. But if you want to give out gift cards and rewards and things like that, absolutely go for it. But give people just something positive to strive for and something that will show them what they should be striving for. Now, the flip side of that is you need to hold people accountable. If they're doing behaviors that are not in line with your privacy and security policies and procedures, then that needs to be something that is corrected and corrected fairly quickly. Because again, people are going to notice and they're going to take direction from that. If you've got somebody who is not following proper procedures and perhaps even putting the company at risk and nobody does anything, people are going to look at that and they're going to say, oh, maybe that policy or procedure is not that important because, you know, so-and-so over here has been doing something different for 2 months and nobody cares. So, you know, obviously it doesn't make that much big of a deal. You know, it's not a big deal. So that's the kind of thing you need to cut off right at the beginning. So if there's a bad behavior, nip it in the bud. When you're telling people about privacy and security behaviors that you want, also try to keep it really relevant. If you have a whole bunch of people packed into a room that are all doing different things in the organization and have different privacy and security questions, concerns, and scenarios, and you try to give all of them the same information, there are people who are going to tune out because there's a whole bunch that's not applicable to them. So as much as possible, and I know sometimes it's not entirely possible, but as much as you can, try to split them up into different target groups and give them the information that's relevant to them. And then as much as possible, switch up your method of delivery. Maybe do a big all-staff meeting once, and then maybe do an email follow-up or a text follow-up, or have posters around the office. I'll tell you, posters on the inside of toilet stalls are going to be the most read things in the entire office. There are different ways to get information to people. The more you can switch it up, the more you buy in terms of time and attention before they burn out or tune out. And then most of all, give them time to practice the proper behaviors. So make sure they know how to identify what counts as PHI and how to de-identify it in case they need to send it somewhere. You know, are they blacking out or removing all the proper fields? Make sure that they have practice in sending PHI securely. Do they know how to access the software? Do they know the proper procedures? Give them a chance to try it out. Have them notice when PHI is on display. Like, did someone leave up the last patient's medical records on the screen? Train them to notice that and what to do about that. Have people notice when the sign-in sheets are showing multiple patient names and therefore giving away PHI. So have everyone be your eyes and ears around the office for that. And then if you can, do some kind of phishing exercise, because again, this is kind of a big vulnerability. So there are actually programs where they will send fake phishing emails to your company. And if people click on them, then instead of going anywhere bad, it notifies your privacy and security so that they can do some kind of training and remediation. Now, it should be clear, this is not a sort of off with their heads type of thing. This should be a training opportunity, but it can be extremely valuable. And with that, I would like to just see if anyone has any major questions they'd like to send in. Just as a reminder, you can send those in through the chat function on the WebEx.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was really fascinating. And we do actually have a question. The question is, there's two questions. The first was, what happens with the money that is collected for fines? What's it used for? Is it used to help those who have their PHI compromised?
That's an excellent question. Most of the time, that money, especially if it's collected through HHS, is actually going back into the OCR operating budget. They actually cut the OCR budget pretty significantly in past years with the idea that they still wanted to do enforcement and they still wanted to ensure people were maintaining proper levels of privacy and security, but they didn't want to have to pay for it. So they said, well, you know what, you can just go out and collect fines and we'll use that to pay for it.
And then secondly, I would love to have other members of my team view this WebEx. Will there be other WebExes, or how can I use the recording to have my other team members view this WebEx?
Another excellent question. So for something like that, a copy of the recording will be sent out to everybody. So if you register, you're going to get an email. It'll probably be later today or tomorrow that will include a link. However, if you would like a live version of this, please feel free to contact me. I've actually already done this once or twice, gone out to external places and given private presentations for this. So please feel free to contact me and ask for that as well.
Okay, well, we're waiting for any other questions to come through. I have one. So last year at my doctor's office, the MA checked me in and left the room, and I happened to turn, and there on the computer screen were the names and reasons for everyone coming to visit the doctor that day. I did alert them, but just curious what kind of breach, if any breach, was that?
Well, that could have hit a couple different categories depending on why that happened. Like one of the first examples that we saw, it could be a lack of privacy and security policies or procedures. It could be a training issue. But we're looking at some kind of improper disclosure at that point. If you had gone and told anybody about it, we definitely would have been in a breach situation. So good thing you didn't spread that PHI around.
All right, if you have any other questions, please submit them now. All right, that looks like that's it for questions, Sarah.
All right, well, thank you everybody for coming. I'm glad that you could join us. Hopefully you will join us for future webinars. We have additional ones on the UHIN.org website. Just go into uhin.org/events. We'll stick around for another couple minutes after the recording ends, and we'll continue to answer any questions that come in. But for the rest of you, thank you again, and have a very great day.